Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. For those of you who are new to my channel, we love having you. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button as well as bell notification icon to stay up to date for weekly interviews and podcasts coming your way. Today's guest on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder is my friend and colleague, Marc Anthony. Marc Anthony, otherwise known as the Psychic Lawyer and the Psychic Explorer, is a fourth-generation psychic medium who communicates with spirits. He is an Oxford-educated attorney licensed to practice law in the state of Florida, Washington, D.C., and before the United States Supreme Court. He recently won the OHME Award for Best Psychic Medium. Marc appears nationwide on TV and radio, including CBS's TV's The Doctor's Gaia TV and the Discovery Channel. He co-hosts a live stream, The Psychic and the Doc, on Transformation Network. The Psychic Explorer travels to mystical locations in remote corners of the world to examine the ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena. He is a featured speaker at conferences, expos, and universities, which include Brown, Columbia, Harvard, and Yale. Marc Anthony is the author of 3 best-selling books. His latest book, The Afterlife Frequency, has won multiple awards and ranked as one of the top books about faith and was up for a Pulitzer Prize nominee. His other best-selling books are Never Letting Go and Evidence of Eternity. He is also the VIP executive contributor for Best Life magazine. Please welcome my next guest, Marc Anthony. Marc Anthony, Psychic Explorer, it's a big honor to have you here on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. How have you been, my man?
I'm doing well, Jacob, and thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure getting to know you over the years. I remember when we met at an IANS International Association for Near-Death Studies conference, and a couple of them, and our paths have crossed a lot. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Oh, yeah, and I certainly remember that moment in 2016 when we met. I was very amped and excited to meet you and just loved your vibe and your energy, a little too excited. But since then we formulated a friendship, and you've been someone that I've deeply admired throughout the years. But for my viewers who aren't familiar with Marc Anthony, could you take us through some of your current work and maybe how you started doing what you're doing? Because you're in a very unique position, as a psychic explorer and also as a psychic lawyer, which is an interesting combination in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you run into too many psychic lawyers who travel around the world examining supernatural phenomenon that also happen to see dead people. I every day I thank God for the gifts that I've been given, and I look at my ability to communicate with spirits as that I am the custodian of the ability, and with it comes responsibility. And I was born into a family where seeing spirits and precognitive, in other words, anticipating future events, appears to be a recessive genetic trait on both sides of my family. Both my mother and my father had these abilities. And when people think of psychics, they tend to think of the stereotypical, the character type. Like a lot of the TV shows, they focus
Right.
more on the medium as a character as opposed to credibility. And my dad was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and after the Navy became an aerospace engineer. And that's about as no nonsense a guy as you're going to get. But he could see spirits, and he could see auras, which was really quite fascinating. And my mother was kind of the whole package. She could see spirits, anticipate future events. She
Wow.
would have visions, and she was just really a lot of fun to hang out with. And they met at a USO dance. My dad had just gotten out of the Navy, and here he is, this 22-year-old full of himself Navy SEAL, and he said, "I saw this foxy looking dame." And he was talking about my mom. She was only 19, but he thought that she was like 30 years old because she was so elegantly dressed.
Mm.
Well, my mom was in the fashion industry, and so she got all the designer clothes wholesale. So
Ah.
mom, in her whole life, she always dressed to the nines. Mom was always really kind of flashy, and so after they met at a couple different dances, and finally she said, I feel, there's something between us, but you have to know that I see spirits.
Mm.
And of course, Jacob, my dad responded as only a sailor can, with a stream of colorful metaphors, followed by "I do too." And then they realized that the connection between them was more than just, he was, a hot Navy SEAL and she was a beautiful woman. And so it's very interesting how they met and how they felt very connected.
Mm.
And I'll spare, because I know we have limited time, but I've tracked the psychic abilities that run in my family back to the 1890s on both sides of the family.
Wow.
Yeah, and but with psychic abilities, it's what's known as a recessive genetic trait, which means that it can skip a generation or two. For
Mm.
example, it's genetic if you're right-handed or left-handed. And 90% of the people in the world are right-handed. Ergo, it's a dominant genetic trait. Left-handedness would be a recessive trait. And you'll see people that are left-handed, there's usually a couple folks in the family that have this. And it appears, for those of us who study psychic phenomenon, it appears that it's the same with the mediumistic, the psychic abilities. And when two parents have that recessive trait, it increases the probability that one of their children will have that, and that would be me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you unloaded a lot just about your background and your families. It's been one of the, one thing that I wanted to highlight was, first of all, when I'm hearing you describe your parents, I think a great testament of a person is to be the undeniable imprint that those before us existed. And it seems from knowing you, the little, the way that I do, I could see both of your parents loud and clear in you. I mean, you're one of the
Oh,
best
thank you.
dressed individuals I've ever seen. You've always has, and I could see mom's imprint on you, but
Yeah.
also, obviously your intuitive capabilities, but also your love of science and, aerospace and everything like that. So, it's just like it could see both of your parents, really loud and clear in you, and I'm sure they were you're both lucky to have each other. But my second point was, this has been a topic of conversation that I've had with a lot of people, which is the genetic or epigenetic component of psychic or mediumistic stuff. And I'm sure there's a nature and nurture
Yeah.
element to it too. But you are the first person to describe it as a genetic uh, aspects. So that is mind blowing to myself and my audience, and I thank
Well,
you for pinpointing that.
that's once again studying science. I mean, there's a reason that we look like our parents. We know that certain intellectual abilities, physical abilities are inherited. Certain diseases, like types of cancer and other type of genetic anomalies, schizophrenia,
Mhm.
runs in family. And you're a therapist. You come across all
We
these type of
understand.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see this. And when I talk about the genetic ability, um, you also have to realize that everyone is capable of having a psychic or a mediumistic experience. And I know that you do, because not only because of your near death experience, but because of your sensitivity and your work with people, and that helps open up that channel. But there's a physiological basis for this. In my book, The Afterlife Frequency, and in my book, Evidence of Eternity, I go into the physiology of what
Mm.
makes it possible for people to have these experiences. And while everyone has the same basic physiology, some people are simply better at it than others. And for example, some people are natural athletes. They're just better. They're faster swimmers,
Mhm.
faster runners. Some people are better at math. Some people are very gifted artists. I mean, I can paint a picture, but I'm never going to be a Salvador Dali or a Monet.
Right. Right.
I can play guitar, but trust me, I'm never going to be a Slash or a Jimi Hendrix or anything like that. But the thing is, I can still have that experience, and it's the same with psychic phenomenon. A lot of my colleagues, they teach like become a medium. It's like, well,
Mm.
yes and no. I think it should be more in tune with your abilities, because I've also seen people who've gone through those classes and are very distraught because they just couldn't do it. It's like putting me in an Olympic swimming club. I mean, I love the water and I swim and I snorkel and all that, but I mean, I'm not going to ever compete
Right.
with Michael Phelps. I mean, that's just not going to happen, you know? So,
Yeah.
so for people exploring your spirituality and your innate psychic and mediumistic abilities, absolutely. But if it doesn't turn into, full blown medium or psychic, then don't worry about it, because we're all good at doing different things.
Mhm.
And let's face it, Jacob, wouldn't it be boring if we were all the same?
Oh my God. And and if we were all doing this professionally, there would be no clients. Whatever, I don't know, so I always say, like, yes, I want to help people, but there's no dysfunction. I don't have any mental health clients. So we kind of, in a way, that keeps us busy, but ideally we would love to cure it. But we're not there. But yeah, I mean, I think you make a great point where there's a gap between the personal and the professional in any walk of life. And just because you can't professionally practice something does not mean you can't go outside, shoot some hoops, or, as you said, go in the pool. You could do it in your own way. So I think there has to be more balance for people who are able to utilize this on a personal basis, but understand that boundary if this is something that I should really pursue on a professional, because it's a very responsible role. People are oftentimes drowning. They're going through desperate, acute levels of grief, and that medium is that one solid, piece to hold on to. And if you are giving them falsified information and they're holding on to that, and it's not true, I mean, that could really drown them. So it's a very responsible role that could, make or break one's, journey through their own grief, as belief, as you always say, is a big pivotal element of grief.
I'm smiling because you said something that just it reminds me of a very funny story. I was working in England, and I was in a class with a group of mediums, and the teacher, he used to be a jockey, and he was a physically smaller guy, very gifted medium. He comes prancing into the class, but he was, and he goes up to the whiteboard and he writes four things. He goes, "We're going to avoid the four assumed dialogues. One, spirits are with you. Two, they love you. Three, they bring you joy. Four, they bring you upliftment." And then he looked at me because I was the only American in the class. He goes, "Oh, and you Americans, if all else fails, do pull out a Native American spirit. Well, there'll be no Hiawatha or Pocahontas in this class." And I'm sitting there and I'm trying not to laugh because it kind of is this whole like
Right.
Professor Snape from Harry Potter
Yeah,
thing,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And and but his point was very well taken.
Mm,
He said the four assumed dialogues are important. People need to know that their loved ones in spirit are around them. They love them. They want them to feel joy and they want them to feel uplifted out of grief. And that's wonderful.
mm,
And his point was, but anyone can tell you that. He said it's receiving evidence,
mm,
pieces of information that are very specific or detailed. It could be a shared memory. It could be something going on with the recipient now. It could be a personality trait or something about the spirit in the past. There's all types of information. And that's why I was attracted to what is known as British evidential mediumship,
mm,
because the British back in the Victorian era started working with this, because spirit contact is part of the human experience.
mm,
It's been documented for thousands of years. And by the Victorian era, there were people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Arthur Finley, and other mediums that wanted to refine it to take it away from the turbans and crystal balls and the Ouija board
mm,
crowd into a much more credible fact and evidence based practice. And in my work, that's why I've developed a lot of terminology to replace the antiquated Victorian era terms and bring spirit communication into the 21st century to explain it on the basis of quantum physics and science, human physiology. So make it credible. It's not magic. It's not hocus pocus.
Mm.
There is a reason for everything and why everything happens.
And I know we'll certainly get into your multiple award-winning book, The Afterlife Frequency, and how incredibly groundbreaking and valuable it is, because I think you make a great point that there needs to be a degree of reframing, professionalism, credibility, and representation of what this is and what this is not. And I know you are able to kind of really spell that out in your third book that you wrote, that's really allowing a lot more people to understand this, from a left brain perspective, and not just kind of hokey pokey kind of stuff, but really getting it down to the nitty gritty of what it is versus what it's depicted as or what would sell, in the whole presentation of it. But before I do that, Mark, I just had a quick question. Um, you mentioned that you come from a big lineage of, intuitives and psychics. When for you did this start? Was this in your teenage years? Were you in college? Were you young? Like, when did you know, hey, I'm different, I'm psychic? Like, how did that all develop for you?
I was 3.5 years old and I started interacting with spirits
Mm,
and I started playing with my invisible friends. Now, it's not unusual for a toddler to have make believe friends,
mhm,
except when mommy and daddy can see who I'm talking to. And I'll
mm,
never forget, I'll never forget this. Mom's like, "Oh, he's got it." And dad's reaction was, "Oh, geez, he's
mm,
got it."
mm.
And the thing is, my father was concerned. Let me take on a tangent, then I'll get back to. See, whenever you ask a lawyer what time it is, we tell you how to build a clock. Um, but about probably 20 years before I was born, my father had four siblings, three sisters and a brother. And one of his sisters, Marjorie, was a medium, as was his mother, Isabel, and maternal grandmother, Grace. And his sister, Marjorie, the medium, she unfortunately married this religious fanatic. I'm not even going to call him a zealot. The guy was a fanatic.
Mm,
And he was afraid of her and her abilities. And one day he was going to work. He was a machinist who worked at a steel plant in Pennsylvania. And she begged him not to go to work. She goes, "Something horrible is going to happen. I know it. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it." And they got into a huge argument and she started crying. He said, "Fine, fine. I'll stay home. That voodoo stuff of yours." And anyway, later that day at the steel plant, and it was in Pennsylvania, this crane was lifting thousands of pounds of steel beams, and all of a sudden the cable broke, and the beams crushed the machine shop
mm.
that he worked in and killed everybody in it.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah, I mean, if he'd been there, he would have been killed, at least 90+% chance. Instead of being grateful, it's intensified his phobia of Marjorie and her abilities. So he conspired with a psychiatrist, one I believe to be very unscrupulous, who diagnosed her without examining her that she was a paranoid schizophrenic. They actually sent an ambulance to her house. Literally, men in white coats came. They forcibly put her into a straitjacket, took her out of her home to a mental institution
Mm,
where she was subjected to electroshock therapy. Now, this is back in the 50s when they were really using the high voltage, and they damaged her brain so much because it took over six
mm.
months before they released her. So she was going for this all the time, against her will. And my father and mother said she never spoke about spirits or seeing the future ever again.
Wow. Wow.
So here I am seeing this, and then when I was 5 years old and I started first grade and I was going to Catholic school, my dad, I remember him saying, "Don't talk to anyone about this except your mother and me." And I was like scared. And I remember, my dad, he was a tough guy, but he was real loving. Like he held me. He could see I was shaking. He
He's
scared me.
protective of you. Yeah.
Protective. Yeah. He said, "Mark, people won't understand. And people who see things others don't will
Mm,
get taken away."
mm,
And I didn't understand what he meant by that until I was in my teens and I started finding out the truth about Aunt Marjorie. And I never
mm.
met her in this world. I
Huh.
write about her in my books because she comes to me spiritually quite often.
Wow.
usually to warn me something like bad's going to happen. And yeah,
Don't go into any factories there, Yeah.
Yeah, going to factories. Well, in my book, The Afterlife Frequency, Aunt Marjorie pops up in chapter 1, and for good reason, for very good reason. And so I kind of kept it to myself. But the thing is, in the neighborhood, everybody knew that my family was different. Like all my friends, especially when I was in college, and my parents lived right near the beach. They lived like a block from the beach, and my fraternity showed up in force one spring break day, and we pitched tents in the yard, and we were camping out there. And it got around that Mark's mother so she was doing like little mini readings on all my fraternity brothers. They're like, yeah. And I'd see them walking out of the living room going, how the hell does she know that? And they were all like, and there was this one guy, and he was a real jerk. He was like super arrogant, and he was always like condescending. And I remember Mom looked at him, and she held his hand, and she hesitated, and she said, you're going to have a very easy life. Well, then, that's all he needed. I'm going to have a very easy life. And I remember later on saying to Mom, why did you tell that pompous ass that? She said, Mark, she said, he's a nothing. He's all talk. And I saw no ambition, no goals, no real achievements. I mean, she said, he'll get a job, he'll make money. She said, but he's not really going to amount to anything really that matters. And so she said, I wanted to be diplomatic. So I just said, you'll have an easy life. and the funny thing is, Jacob, I ran into him about 15 years later, and Mom was right on point.
Wow.
He had a job, he had a vacuous girlfriend, and it was like a huge piece of styrofoam, and God bless him, and everybody counts and everybody matters. And perhaps his role in life is just to be that big piece of styrofoam. But the thing is, it got to be in my neighborhood. We were the cool family, but kind of the weird cool family. So I always say that we were sort of like, the Addams family in the neighborhood. But when I was a teenager, I wanted to go into the clergy which is not unusual for a medium. We're drawn to the spiritual. And, I had been raised in the Catholic faith, and I was like, too many rules, regulations. And come on, I was a teenage guy, and celibacy was not exactly, not exactly a big draw for me.
At the top of your triage.
It wasn't even in the forest. But I also felt that there were too many rules and regulations, yet I end up going to law school. Okay. So talk about rules and regulations.
Yeah.
But what I liked about law is I always enjoyed public speaking. I enjoy giving presentations. I enjoy working with people. And also the thing about law is it puts you in everything. I don't know if you ever saw that older movie. It's called The Devil's Advocate, where Al Pacino plays the devil, and he's the head of a law firm, and his young associate's Keanu Reeves. And in the end, of course, Keanu Reeves, when he discovers, who Al Pacino is, why the law and Al Pacino? It's only Al Pacino can, goes, because it puts you in everything. and I just love that because it's true. Think about it. Is there any aspect of our lives where there's not some form of law, rule, or regulation? And I know a lot of people think that's bad. On the other hand, if you drink water that is safe to drink, thank the FDA, okay? Thank the rules and regulations. If you have an electrical system that doesn't start a fire, if you have streets that are safe to walk, professions like yours, like the legal profession, medical profession, are all regulated. So law puts you into everything. And I always had an interest in theology, archaeology, history, but now in law, I had to learn about forensics, physics, biochemistry, neurobiology, the study of the human brain, because I specialized in head injury and brain damage, brain injury litigation. So I had to learn about the human brain. So by the time I decided to transition out of law, I had all these transferable skills that now I could apply to my research to make the case and to find the evidence that supports the physiological and the scientific basis for the existence of the afterlife and for spirit communication.
I love what you just said at the end because a lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm just doing a human job," or whatever like that, and that's not going to help me with my spirituality. But it seems from the life that you lived, you've been able to use something that we would feel like has nothing to do with mediumistic work, working as a courtroom. And it seemed like that has equipped you and prepared you for the work that you're doing today. And I know you have like a phrase that I love where the afterlife is about, in a way, and doing the work that you're doing is about building the case of evidence of
Yeah.
eternity, no different than your work as a lawyer. So it seems like what you're doing now is just what you're doing before on steroids in a heightened sense, and I'm wondering, do you think this was all in the playing for you? Like this aspect of your life, do you feel like that was something that you gravitated to prepare you for the work that you're doing today?
I believe that it has, but I don't think that I'm special. Everyone is special. And I was talking about my fraternity brother was a big piece of styrofoam.
Mm,
But the thing is, every life matters. Every life counts.
sure.
And we all have gifts from God. If you're a good parent, that's a gift from God. If you're a good listener, okay, you may be, and I run into people all the time, and I'm one of them, where you'll be on a bus and the proverbial stranger will just tell me their entire life story. You don't know if you just saved that person's life simply because you gave someone the time of day and listened.
Mm,
You can be a good carpenter, a good drywaller, a good gardener, a good dentist. No matter what you're good at, that's a gift from God because you're helping other people.
mm,
You could be a checker at a store. All right, that too is a gift because you're helping people. It's just that the gifts that I've been blessed with tend to be what most people consider a little bit different or even a little bit strange. But the thing is, we're all of us are the sum total of our experiences in the past. And I'll have to admit, mine have been very unusual to lead me on the path that I'm going on now.
mm,
And I do believe that we all have a direction, a somewhat preordained path, but we have a lot of control over the decisions that we make because I could very well have avoided and rejected going into full time mediumship
mm.
and stayed within the practice of law. But I made the conscious decision well, I don't know if I ever told you how I made that decision.
Hmm.
Um, when my mother died, everything in my life changed. And I remember I was in my office one day and I was thinking about spaghetti. And of course, my mother's family's Italian. So, we eat a lot of Italian food. But I was thinking about spaghetti and the phone rang. It was my mom. And she said, "I just made spaghetti for lunch. Why don't you come over?" And I
Mm,
thought, hey, why not? My parents didn't live that far from my office. And we had a wonderful time, beautiful lunch. And mom looked tired. I noticed
mm,
she looked tired. My dad was there. And when I was leaving, she said, "Mark, I want to talk to you for a second." And I go, "Sure." She said,
mm,
"I just want you to know, I just love you so much, and I'm so happy you're my son."
mm.
And I said, "I love you too, Mom." Well, the next day, I was in court, and the judge's assistant came into the courtroom and said, "Mark, we need you in chambers right now."
Mm,
And they handed me the phone, and it was my secretary who was in tears. And she said, "Your dad called, your mother died."
right.
And she had,
Putting me in tears now.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it was like my whole world. I just spiraled into this
Oy.
horrific depression.
Mm,
And then, um, about 3 weeks after that, I was driving back from court, and I'd finally gotten to the point where I could
connect.
start to handle
Mm,
things. You know how like when a wave of grief hits you and you just
mm,
spiral into that. Well, one of those waves hit me, and I figured I better pull over. I'm a
mm.
senior partner in a law firm. I cannot walk into the office crying. So I got to be the guy. I got to be the
Yeah,
alpha
yeah,
male here. And
yeah.
so I'm sitting alone in my car at this convenience store parking lot
Mm,
off, away from like the front door. And all of a sudden there's this flash of light.
Mm.
And to this day, Jacob, I don't know if it was like light in the car or the light you see in your mind's eye,
Mm.
but there was this flash, and I immediately turned to the passenger side, and I saw in silver white light the silhouette of my mother.
Wow.
Okay, so now I'm reeling from this, and her voice hears my head. And she says, Mark, you've been given the gift of mediumship so that you would not be crushed by grief. But now you must help those who are suffering with theirs.
Mm.
And I'm like, now I'm breaking out in a sweat. And then I hear her voice again. And she said, your life's mission is to help people understand that God exists, that heaven exists, that your souls are immortal living spirits, that people can communicate with souls,
Mm.
and that we will all be reunited in the light that is God when it is your appointed time to leave the material
Mm.
world. All right, Jacob, I sink back into my seat. Now I'm soaking wet with sweat. And
Mm.
all I can say is, okay. And then I sat there for some minutes trying to process this, and then I'm thinking I can't tell anybody this. I mean, people think I'm weird as it is, and now they're going to
Mm.
think I'm insane. But I also realized that my life had changed from ever, and it would never be the same. And then within another 2 weeks, I was offered a job at a government agency. And that was interesting because I figured, okay, because I started work within those 2 weeks on my
Mm.
first book, Never Letting Go. And running a law firm is a
Mm.
7 day, a week. I mean, it's just a really, so I thought, all right, government job, Monday, Friday. So I shifted into that. And then when my book Never Letting Go came out, I brought on Rocky, Rocky, my manager,
Of
and
course, and we have Never Letting Go right here.
Never
It's
Letting Go. There it is.
one of my favorite books of all time. Really, I
Oh,
love it. I've read it so many times. Yeah.
oh, thank you. Thank you. So Rocky got me a speaking gig in New York City and got me on an MSNBC show, which was like way
Wow.
cool. And it was
Wow.
really neat because we were at 30 Rock and we were in the studio next to where they filmed Saturday Night Live, and it was like,
Wow.
wow. And then she got me a gig to speak at Harvard a couple of days after that. So we
Wow.
left from New York and we flew up to Boston, and it was near Christmas time, and I remember it was like cold, and I got these hot cups of coffee,
Mm.
and all of a sudden my cell phone rings, and it's the elected official of the government agency that I work for. And he says, I'm catching all types of grief from the Republican Party because I have a psychic on staff, and he's going on and on and on, and I take too much time off and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, but it's all my vacation time. And he's going on and on and on. And I said, you know what? Let me make this easy for you. He goes, how so? I go, please accept this as my resignation. He goes,
Wow.
okay. And I remember I hung up my phone, and then I go, oh my God, Rocky, I just quit the legal profession.
Mm.
And
Wow.
she said, Mark, look around. Where are you? I'm looking around. I go, Harvard. And she goes, and what are you doing in an hour? I
Mm.
said, signing copies of my new book and giving a talk on the afterlife. And she said, don't you think this is exactly where you're supposed to be?
Mm. Wow.
And Jacob, I've never looked back. And so your question earlier, do you think this was part of a plan? Yeah, I do. It's funny when people say, "Oh, I had this enlightening experience on top of a mountain." It's like,
Mm.
mine was like in a car and a fire hose to the face, right? Boom.
Right.
And the thing is, I didn't open the door. I got shoved through it so quick, so fast, it took the hinges off, and I don't regret it. And the thing is, though, I could have resisted. I
Mm.
could have decided to stick to my, the job that I trained for and had been proficient at for many years. But I knew that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And I once again, I count myself very blessed because I have so many people that I hear say, I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know what I'm doing in life. And maybe you are doing what you're supposed to be doing. You just not have accepted it, or maybe you have been resisting the path you're supposed to be on.
Mm. Mm. And I think we all are very hard on ourselves oftentimes. We don't recognize, as you mentioned before, the impact that we have. And so many people, they define themselves what they do, but not how they are necessarily being while they are doing. I mean, you could have a PhD and Elmer Fudd be like Einstein or whatever. So it's a matter of what you make of your profession, who you are, more importantly. I've probably had better therapy sessions with my barbers and some of my, PhD clinical psychology, counselors. So I think it really has to do with who you are, and that could be channeled throughout different forms. But your job is to be yourself, expressed consistently. I had a friend of mine who passed away, and we were talking about him, and someone mentioned that he says it's nice to kind of know that that same energy that we all know just kind of translated itself to different forms, and we all knew him the same way. It was just a different dynamic, and I think with whatever we do, we want to be true to ourselves personally, professionally, and our job is just to be ourselves. But I commend you for doing what you're doing and taking that leap of faith. It almost reminds me of Dr. Wayne Dyer when he was, I think, teaching at St. John's and offered tenure, and he just turned that down and said, "No, there's just something that's calling me." And I think he wrote Erroneous Zones in a couple of days and became this best-selling guy. And the Buddha too, to a degree, he had a life of material comfort, but there was something else that was just calling him, this like inner spiritual calling, where he could have been a great emperor or a great kind of spiritual teacher. And it seems like for you, you could just tapped into what wasn't necessarily comfortable, but what you were intended to do in this life.
Yes, and it's interesting that you talk about Buddha. For people who aren't don't know that much about Buddha, was born Siddhartha Gautama, and
Hmm.
he was in northern India, and he was a prince. He was a princely family, and he went into the wilderness for I think like 40, 44, 45 days. He was tempted by Lord Mara, the Lord of Illusion. Doesn't this sound very much like when Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights? Jesus was a descendant of the house of King David
Mm,
of
yeah,
Israel.
yeah.
And both Jesus and Buddha had this royal lineage. Clearly, they had incredible speaking abilities, spiritual abilities, intellectual
Mm,
abilities. And a lot of people believe that Jesus was an earthly incarnation of God. Other people believe he was a great prophet. Other people believe he was an avatar. Same
mm,
thing, the Buddhists don't believe that Buddha was divine or God, but that he was divinely inspired. But both of them had a similar experience
mm,
where they were tempted by illusion and evil. People say Jesus was tempted by Satan. I take a more metaphorical approach. Both of
mm,
them had all these gifts, they had the lineage, and they both could have cashed in on it. Jesus could have, become a great Hebrew leader and
mhm,
possibly even overthrown the Herodian dynasty, which in retrospect probably would not have been a bad thing. But the thing is, were they really tempted by evil, or was this a metaphor of the spirit overcoming the ego?
mm,
Because the ego always tempts you with the promise of something you already possess.
mm,
Oh, you can be great. You can be this. You can
mm,
be powerful. That was what both of these negative entities were tempting both Buddha and Jesus with.
mm.
And when they both rejected them, then they embraced the way of the light and of the spirit versus the ego. I like to call ego edging God
I love
out.
that saying. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in other words, you don't have to do something to be something. You already are connected to that thing. You just need to tap into it. Or as Michelangelo would say, chip away at the masterpiece that's always there and just express it. But
Yeah.
not being defined by what we do in our titles. Those are just temporary, trips of the ego. But it's funny that you correlate Jesus and the Buddha, because I heard someone said that Buddha is like Jesus Christ of the East in a way. They're similar in a way.
Very similar. Obviously, when you talk about Jesus to some people, he's the Messiah, God on
Mm,
earth. And if you want to believe that, that's fine. And I was raised in a faith where that was what
mm,
what we were taught. And maybe he was, or maybe he was showing us what Buddha was trying to show us, that there is a way of peace and love and understanding, forgiveness,
mm,
that we're all interconnected, that we're all the
mm,
children of God. And because both of them, their teachings are so similar, it's all about peace and nonviolence. unfortunately, and I don't want to go through a whole history lesson, but once the Romans got hold of Christianity, it took on a very different character.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't, and his teachings didn't. It's what the empire did with it, because when the empire became Christian, then Christianity became an extension of imperial authority, and that's kind of where it all gets clouded. But I think that we can sift through it. And we also need to realize that both Jesus and Buddha taught through metaphor and parables. Jesus's all of his teachings, or a good deal of them, dealt with the parable of like the prodigal son, of the good Samaritan, of the 7 foolish bridesmaids and the lamps. So when people say, well, I take a literal translation of the Bible, it's like, yeah, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. Which brings me to the name of this show.
Yes. Yeah.
Jacob's Ladder, the wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Now, for all the listeners, if you haven't read the book, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, not only did I endorse it, and Jacob asked me to write the foreword, and I really wanted to, but unfortunately, when I needed to write it, I was on a nationwide tour, and I simply didn't have the time. Okay, your next book, if you want me to, I'll do that. But the thing is, Jacob's Ladder is first mentioned in the book of Genesis, and Jacob, the son of Isaac, he's on a trip, and he gets tired. He lays down, uses a rock as his pillow. Then he has a dream, and he sees this ladder between heaven and earth, and an unending procession of angels ascending and descending. Jacob's Ladder is one of the most mystical and unusual passages in Scripture. It is one of the most heavily studied, not just by Hebrew and Christian scholars, but also by Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, many different religious scholars examine it because it has so many different metaphorical meanings. One of them is the timelessness of time. Another is the interconnectedness between heaven and earth. Another is the rise and fall of human vainglory. And then another one is reincarnation. And that the angels on an unending procession between heaven and earth is a metaphor for the eternal cycle of life, which the Hindus call samsara, which is birth, death, rebirth, and in an unending cycle of life. And I love that with Jacob, our host of the show, he has a very special twist on it in his book about the ladder and about how it relates to his near-death experience. It is also possible that one of the metaphors of Jacob's Ladder could be a near-death experience. Maybe something happened to the prophet Jacob. He ascended on that ladder into the light, encountered the angels, and returned. So you can see when you start looking at that. So you definitely chose the right title for your book and for this show, because it is one of the most spiritually enlightening and mystical and mysterious passages in any religious scripture worldwide.
Wow. Well, thank you for the individual shout out and high praise. It's a biblical Jacob. The reason why I chose that was I was in a playground and I had my NDE on a literal ladder onto a slide. We have a lot of common, in a sense that we were both 3 years old when we had our mystical experiences. But yes, Jacob, it could believed in a way that he was having a quote unquote NDE because his brother Esau was chasing him, after getting the Covenant. He was running for his dear life after
Yeah.
that, and he saw the angels going up and down. And for myself, you saying this, I had all of this in my NDE, past lives, the awareness of the timelessness, all upon, this ladder in a playground, and the allegorical references. We are all children here in God's playground, and I was just a child here, in God's playground having my NDE. So I do thank you for that shout out, and it just it allows me to understand even deeper, the value of Jacob's Ladder, how how
Yeah,
significant it is.
it really does. I remember there was a movie some years back called Jacob's Ladder, and I tried to watch it, and it was just an idiotic horror movie. So because when you Google Jacob's Ladder, that garbage comes up,
Right,
and
right,
you
right,
need to get away from that and get to the work you're doing. And I find it fascinating. Like that's why I said it had a twist. Your ND happened on a ladder,
right.
okay? And so once again, things are not coincidental, and
No,
in
no.
many ways, you are once again breathing new life into
Oh,
the
shucks.
many metaphors of Jacob's ladder.
That well, thank you, and know that for viewers, it was not directed by me. I was not. That's not the dark version of me. Nothing to do with it. This is the wisdom of Jacob's ladder. It's all about the light. It's not about anything but that. But I wanted to talk more about you, Mark, because your book, The Afterlife Frequency, has
Yeah, thank you.
received
Yeah.
tremendous accolades, awards, even an endorsement by my birthday twin, Shirley MacLaine, gave high praises to it. But your book, you know, tell us a little bit about how it differentiates from your first two books, which I absolutely loved. To me, your first two books are just a great combination of powerful stories that you provide, as well as explaining the correlationship with the hereafter. But this book, what is the different twist of this book versus your first two, or some of the other, top selling books on
Sure.
mediumship and afterlife that others and yourself has noticed?
Well, I didn't want to just write version one, version two, version three of the same book. And with all due respect to my mediumship and psychic colleagues, that tends to be what their books are.
Mm,
Okay, they just write the same thing over and over,
mm,
and that's fine because it needs to be out there. Okay, it needs to be out there, it needs to be understood. I wrote Never Letting Go as a guide on the journey through grief. It inspires with messages of love and healing from the other side. It teaches you about coping with loss, and it's very healing.
mm,
And Never Letting Go is for when you're in that fog, you don't know where to turn, what
mm,
to do. That's why I wrote it, because when I was in that fog after my
mm,
mom passed, I was looking for something, and there was a couple books I read that weren't bad, but I wanted to write one that would help people. And I'm very honored that it's been recommended by hospices, grief counselors, therapists worldwide. Then, when I was on the Never Letting Go book tour, people started asking questions. My child died by suicide. Did he go to hell? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Do animals have souls? Is reincarnation real? Is there an explanation for all of this? And so Rocky and I started keeping track of the most asked questions.
mm,
And that became kind of the outline, not kind of, it became the outline for what I wanted to address in Evidence of Eternity and put forth my case
mm,
to help people understand about suicide, coping with loss, animals having souls, heaven, hell, and also the reality of spirit communication. And I was very, very overwhelmed and humbled at how well both of those books did. And then I decided I wanted to take the science, because in all my books, there's science.
mhm,
And where that comes from, when I was 8 years old, no, I was younger than that. I think I was about 5 or 6. I was standing
mm,
next to my dad and we were looking at the stars. And dad said, there's an explanation for everything. If you spend enough money, research, funding, and focus, dedication, you will find an explanation for everything, and it will be through science. And
mm,
that really resonated with me. And that's why I wrote The Afterlife Frequency. The subtitle is The Scientific Proof of Spiritual Contact and How That Awareness Will Change Your Life. Because I wanted to take this out of the superstition, the hocus pocus in the realm, and explain it in a way that people can understand it. And the reason that it's different from other books by mediums is because of the scientific
mm,
component. Also, My electromagnetic soul theory provides a basis not just for spirit contact, but for the existence of the soul, for reincarnation,
Mm.
for near-death experiences, shared death experiences, out-of-body experiences, deathbed visions.
Hmm.
And if I may, we know that everything's made of molecules, which in turn are made of atoms, which in turn are comprised of electrons, protons, and neutrons, which in turn are composed of the smallest particle of quanta, which is pure electromagnetic energy. And when you start thinking about that, you got to realize that everything, our bodies, Jacob, the microphones we're talking into, the radio waves that this show is being broadcast on, the
Mm.
light from the sun, the rings of Saturn and beyond are all electromagnetic energy. Everything is interconnected.
Sure.
And it's just that they vibrate at different frequencies, which is why we're alive. And this book is an inanimate
Mm.
object, but on the subatomic level, it is made of the same particles of electromagnetic energy that I am. That we know from faith that every great teacher, from the sages of ancient India through Buddha,
Mm.
Zoroaster, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Gandhi, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Mother Teresa, Native American spirituality, African spirituality, the religions of the Pacific, all believe that the who and what we are is not this body, but an energy. The Hawaiians call it a mana, okay? The mana that comes into the body, and then when the body ceases to function, moves on. We know from the laws of thermodynamics in physics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. So I developed the electromagnetic soul theory to explain what we really are: pure consciousness, a soul, a spirit, the who and what we are.
Mm.
That is pure electromagnetic energy, and it's neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form or to one incarnation to another. And so anyway, that's one of the key concepts in my book, The Afterlife Frequency. And throughout that book, I explain how the EMS provides the basis for all the different forms of spiritual contact. And that's why this book is different than anything else written by any other mediums,
Mm.
because they tend to focus strictly on mediumship, which once again is okay to do that. But I'm taking a much broader
Mm.
approach because all of it is interconnected. Isn't it interesting, Jacob? As a near-death experiencer, one of the side effects or after effects of an NDE is a sense of interconnectedness, right?
Mm. Absolutely. Yeah.
And what does quantum physics prove? We are all energetically interconnected. Another one is the timelessness of time, right? That
Mm.
time doesn't exist. Well, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, on the quantum level, on that electromagnetic level, time doesn't exist. This is also why in psychic and mediumistic readings, spirits will bring up future events that you
Mm.
and I can't see because they're able to perceive this. So when you start looking at all the different forms of spirit
Mm.
communication, near death experiences, the shared death, deathbed visions, and how they all involve some communication with spirits, it's all because of the EMS, the electromagnetic soul.
Huh. You know, without all the stress in school science classes, if they called it mysticism, I think a lot more people would tune in, because when you listen to some of the scientists talk, like Einstein and some of these other people, they almost seem like mystics or philosophers in what they're saying. But it's put on the umbrella of science, or like, all right, this isn't spiritual, this is theoretical. But it seems like what you're saying, that there's an emergence between spirituality and science. There's not a
Yeah.
big war. But why do you feel some perceive the gap between the two of them? Why has there been a perceived gap between science and spirituality? What
I- I'm
factored into it?
smi- I'm smiling because it begins with one of my favorite people, Sir Isaac Newton.
Mm.
He was a superstar of the Enlightenment in the 1600s.
Is he a
And
religious man too, or you
yeah,
think?
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Newton was quite the character during the plague of 1665. And by the way, he believed in plagues. Okay, and then but he self-quarantined and he developed the laws of optics. He invented calculus, and he refined the laws of gravity. That's how he, instead of watching Netflix, which obviously they didn't have then, but that's what he developed. But see, and with Newtonian reductive materialism, Newton believed that the subatomic world, that everything was made of molecules, which in turn were made of atoms, and everything in the subatomic world was just a miniaturized version of our world. But what I call, and this is my term, the Newton paradox. He believed in God, but he didn't believe in a soul or an afterlife. Okay? But one of the greatest geniuses this world has ever produced spent more time studying the Bible, looking for cryptic messages, than he did studying science. I mean, this is a guy that basically invented physics, calculus, the laws of optics, laws of gravity, laws of motion. Okay,
and it's like a side hustle for him. His primary focus is the Bible.
Was the Bible. But the funny thing about Newton is he was like acerbic. He was not a nice guy. He had a habit of insulting everybody's intelligence. He was mean. He was nasty. From what we can tell, he never had any type of interpersonal relationship. He was just a very condescending, acerbic, bitter intellectual who was brilliant off the scale. So as a result of Newton and what was known as the Enlightenment, that science began to flourish. And Newtonian reductive materialism believes that there is nothing beyond the subatomic, that God doesn't exist. It's all a very here and now. Well, Newton, and of course, and the Newtonians looked at people of faith as wallowing in Bronze and Iron Age primitive superstitious nonsense. And so think of it like a fighting rink, okay, a boxing rink. And in this corner, we have faith. And in this corner, we have reductive Newtonian materialism. Okay, and the two have been at it. Now starts to come the late 19th century, early 20th century. People appear on the scene such as Albert Einstein, Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, who start to see that, wait a second, there's something more than atoms. There's electrons, protons, and neutrons, and now there's quantum. So now they're seeing that Newton, and of course he was limited by the technological capabilities of the day. Now we realize there's three other levels beyond what he was talking about, or two other levels beyond what he was talking about. And with the electromagnetic connection with everything, that there is quite a bit more. And it's funny because I was given a lecture one time and I said, somebody goes, well, this is really hard to wrap your head around. And I said, you think? It took Albert Einstein to figure this out, Albert Einstein, Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Louis de Broglie. I mean, these people, and Mileva, Einstein, Einstein's first wife really gets the shaft in history because she worked with him on developing the theory of relativity. And she was a brilliant scientist, but because she was a woman, she got shoved off to the side. So I'm giving a shout out for Mileva Maravich, also AKA Mileva Einstein. So then Nikola Tesla comes along and says what one man calls God, or one person calls God, another calls the laws of physics. Here we are in the 21st century, and Dr. Michio Kaku, originator of string theory, that there's not just one universe but several, said that the laws of physics or eternal life does not violate the laws of physics. And a lot of quantum physicists like Hans-Peter Dohr of the Max Planck Institute in Germany said that the brain is merely like a computer hard drive. It hosts the soul. It didn't create it. So now we're getting the quantum physicists chiming in and saying that faith and science very well have been describing the same thing, yet through different vernacular.
Yes.
And that's what I'm doing. That's another reason the Afterlife Frequency is different than other books in the field, because I'm taking that ball and running with it by explaining how there's really no divide between faith and science, that they're using different vernacular, and by introducing new terminology based on sound scientific principles to let us understand that life truly is eternal. We have one life. Dr. Gary Schwartz, a dear friend who wrote the foreword for the Afterlife Frequency, his wife Rhonda, an amazing medium and researcher, she said that we have one life and it's eternal.
Wow.
And I completely, wholeheartedly agree with that.
So I think this book in many ways is a priest brokerage with science and spirituality and finding ways to merge the two. And it also helps to destigmatize, and I think it can invite some of the people that are, hard into science and need the explanation of it, to have them to feel more safe. So that, obviously cynics don't work, but people who are skeptics, I think, would really enjoy this book because it's evidential, it's data driven, and it's based off of, the emergence of science and spirituality. You also, in this book, have also merged mental health with this afterlife. Could you speak a little bit about how you see the two correlating with this afterlife frequency, mental health, spirituality, mental health? I know you went into PTSD,
Yeah.
depression, all this kind of stuff, which I think is great because I see a lot of separation of church and state when it comes to mental health and spirituality. And I think the
Yeah.
two, and I know you have a quote that belief works well with grief, but I think really there's a real synergistic bond that the two can have. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Well, it would probably not probably, it will definitely take more time than we
Yeah,
have,
yeah.
but I've found that spirit communication is an important therapeutic step in the journey through grief. And anyone who's lost a loved one knows that. I work a lot with the organization Helping Parents Heal.
Mhm.
And Helping Parents Heal is a beautiful, beautiful organization that simply does that. It helps parents who have lost a child heal. And they employ mediumship as part of a cross disciplinary approach, because you still have to have counseling.
Mhm.
You have to have counseling. You have to have family, and your support group has
Mhm.
to be there, and that is extremely important, because no one should go through grief alone. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and we generally think of that in context of the military. However, um, everybody, I believe, suffers from PTSD to some extent.
To some extent,
To
yes.
some extent, if you've seen a loved one die,
Mhm.
that's going to affect you.
Mhm.
I was there when my dad stopped breathing. That is something I will never forget.
Mhm.
You could be in a horrific car accident, or go through cancer. I mean, there's a lot of ways to suffer in this world, and when you emerge from the experience, you're traumatized. And I'm
Yeah.
glad that there's people like you, Jacob, that are helping people confront and get through this. Because in the past, it was like, "Oh, you're a man, suck it up." I
Mhm.
mean, in World War II, they used to call PTSD shell shock. Oh, it's just from the battle, and there was a very high profile incident of General George S. Patton visiting an Army hospital, and there was a guy there that to him looked perfectly healthy. He goes, "What's wrong with you?" He goes, "They say it's my nerves," and he slapped the man in the face,
Mm.
and he
Mm.
said, "Send him back to the front lines."
Mm.
Okay. Then in Vietnam, it was called battle fatigue. So by Vietnam, the Vietnam era, it was beginning to be seen as a very real
Mhm.
psychological condition. And certainly now with post-traumatic stress disorder, we're seeing that it certainly is. So wherever there's war, there's going to be PTSD, but wherever there's suffering, wherever there's loss and pain, and so spirit communication can be a very healing step in your journey through grief, and through also for coming to terms with your
Mhm.
PTSD. What people need to understand is spirit communication is not a Harry Potter magic wand that I flick and wave and make you all better. What it does is it establishes a connection between you and your loved one in spirit, to let you understand the person that meant so much to you did not disintegrate into nothingness, but that his or her electromagnetic soul, the who and what we really are, is eternal energy that is simply transitioned to a different frequency, a different dimension. And that we will, like what my mother told me, God, the divine. Now, when I talk about God, I know a lot of people roll their eyes. All right. God is not
There's a religious
is this
association with
yeah,
that.
God is not a neurotic white man sitting on a throne with a scepter smiting people for not tithing 10% to the church of the
Yeah, yeah.
extreme, God is beyond our understanding and yet so very close to our own heart. I remember a spiritual avatar who happened to be a Beatle, George Harrison, said a Hindu belief is when you look into the eyes of someone you love who loves you back, you catch a glimpse of God.
Hmm. Very
And
powerful statement.
it
Yes.
is. Love is energy. And it's been said that we are all cells in the body of God. Now we're getting back to the electromagnetic energy. In Christianity and Judaism, Islam, God always was, always will be. Woo! Okay, energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. And for people who have near death experiences, there's phases of the near death. Sometimes people just get the floating experience and then they come back to their body. Other times they get that, then they'll go through the tunnel into the light and encounter people that have passed that they love. Sometimes they'll get even further than that and encounter the divine, which is usually depicted in a form of white light. Sometimes people say, I saw Jesus, although Hindus tend to see Vishnu, Shiva, Krishna, Buddhists tend to see Buddha. And atheists will come back saying, I'm not an atheist anymore. And there's reasons for why different cultures will see the depiction that they associate with God. In other words, we are finite beings, and in a near-death experience, we're operating on a finite perception, and we encounter the infinite. So it would be easier for me as a Christian to relate to the infinity that is God in the person of Jesus. It'd be easier for a Hindu to say, oh, this is Shiva. Maybe with Jewish people, it would be the light. I mean, when Moses encountered the burning bush, the bush that burned yet was not consumed by the fire, how would you in the Bronze Age describe an encounter with an intense concentration of highly developed electromagnetic energy? Fire, because that would be the most powerful radiant energy outside of lightning that you would be familiar with. The bush that burned yet did not burn. So Moses would have been describing in the terminology available to him. So when I talk about God, I do believe in God. I just don't believe in the mythological, like I said, the neurotic white guy sitting on a throne that, and when people say I'm God fearing, it's like fear. How many times did Jesus say fear not in scripture? Is a lot. Same thing with Buddha. Fear is a real downer. And being liberated from fear is love. And so that is the universal energy. Dr. Gary Schwartz refers to my electromagnetic soul theory. He said, don't look at it as so technical that it removes the human component, because the word soul should be looked at as the source of universal love.
Love it. Love it. Wow. No, Dr. Gary Schwartz, I absolutely love his books too. And he also was able to endorse, my personal book. But Raymond Moody actually wrote a book a couple years ago called "God is Bigger Than the Bible," which
Excellent, excellent
I
book.
think is a great concept, because there's a kernel of truth, I think, within every faith,
Yeah.
but it's not the possessiveness of it. And I think we have to remember that it's just a path up to the mountain, a way of understanding, but it's just kind of like a prism of lights, and thinking that that light is the only light. There's a spectrum of it, which, as we know in near-death experiences, that light is not based off of the limitations of the sun rays. That light is much broader basis, and we're
Right.
able to, that's why NDers have a hard time describing the light that they see, because the light that we witness in this life is based off of the sun. So, Mark, my last question for you is, you have like a really good show with Dr. Pat. Could you tell the viewers a little bit about that show and where to find you guys? Because I tune in a lot, and I find the banter between the view and the conversations and the topics to be really spot on and creative and outside the box, and I think pivotal. So tell us, like, what's a little bit about your podcast with you and Dr. Pat, and where they could find you guys.
Certainly, it's a live stream show every Thursday, 4 p.m. Pacific,
Mm,
uh, 5 p.m. Mountain, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern.
mm,
And you go to transformationtalkradio.com or go to my website, afterlifefrequency.com, just like my book, Afterlife Frequency. And every Thursday, my co-host, Dr. Pat Basili, she's awesome. She's the
yeah.
founder of the Transformation Network and the host of the Dr. Pat Show, which is on every day. I believe it's on 1 p.m. Eastern. But every Thursday, Dr. Pat and I, people call into the show, and sometimes we have guests on. We had Jacob on one time, and
Yeah.
we'd love to have you bact. And because you have so many wonderful things to talk about.
Well,
But
thank you.
occasionally we have guests. But oftentimes we'll take calls from listeners, and I'll conduct a reading for the
Mm,
listener. And then Dr. Pat will help them understand the nuances, what it means using her experience as a behavioral psychologist.
mm,
And it's amazing what she's able to get people to understand.
mm.
And this show's been very healing, and it just won Best Holistic Life magazine's Radio Show of the Year award for
Woo!
2024. Yeah, we were very honored.
Wow.
My book, The Afterlife Frequency, won the Cover Award, Coalition of
Yeah,
Visionary Resources, for Best Book
that's it.
in Reincarnation, Death, and Grieving. It won Best Holistics Life, Most Inspirational Book of the Year, and it won the OMI Award by Om Times and iHeartMedia as the Best Metaphysical Book of the Year.
Mm,
And what is so overwhelming is none of those awards I applied for. I mean,
mm,
I just all of a sudden it was announced,
right.
and the same thing with the psychic and the doc. So I invite all of you to tune in, and because we will take your calls, so you can find out about all of that, about signing up for my newsletter. I'm on a U.S. tour. I'm going to be speaking. I'll be in Houston. I'm going to be at the Sedona Spirit. Sedona Ascension Retreat, at
Mhm.
the New Living Expo, and at the Edgar Cayce Association's
Wow.
Reincarnation Summit, and at Helping Parents Heal. So I've got a lot of events coming up this year and always. So go to my website, afterlifefrequency.com. You can find out about my book, signing up for a reading, and I do invite you to subscribe to my newsletter. So, and one
Awesome.
last thing, I write for Best Holistic Life magazine, and every month I have articles that I try to keep edgy and entertaining, but also something that you'll get something from, which
Mhm.
will help you on your journey. Jacob, I can't thank you enough for having me on the show.
Oh, an honor, Mark. And if people want a reading, I know you do individuals as well as some
Yes,
groups, and they could find you through Facebook and Instagram as well too. I know you have some
yes,
great
yeah.
posts and events there. So, Mark, an honor to have you. You're welcome back anytime. Please check out all of Mark's books, particularly Evidence of Eternity. Buy it off of its website as well as Amazon. It is an award-winning, best-selling book, and it's really going to help you, as well as I'd recommend buying a couple copies for loved ones that could really benefit from it. So, Mark, whenever you're around, please come back here on the channel. We love having you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. God bless.
You're a brilliant man. Thank you.
It was a wonderful conversation with Mark Anthony. I really got a lot of information from the psychic level, mediumistic level, and just some insights for everyday life, and well as understanding the energetic frequencies, the science behind afterlife communication, And so I do highly recommend checking out all of his books, particularly The Afterlife Frequency, as Marc to me is an international treasure. Well, that's it for our week's episode here on the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder. We hope to see you here next week as we continually to climb the ladder, grow together, evolve together, and explore different levels and different ways of living and consciousness. Thank you all. We'll see you next week.